One day, you'll learn. No heart is so small that it can embrace only one lover.
Not to mention all the deceit and betrayals and broken vows.
No one should ever pledge their troth. We mistake passion for durability and the particular for unique.
Have you written that?
If only I could. There'd be much less unhappiness in the world if we were all authentic.
Authentic.
True to our nature.
Huh.
I long for a colony of artists where women can live openly and free.
In Boston or Philadelphia?
Obviously, it will have to be someplace abroad.
Miss Cushman, like unto an angel herald, I trumpet forth the universe imperiled.
Fie, Mr. Forrest, you forgot to knock.
So steeped in sin, you'll soon survive the shock. Provoke a gentleman, and he'll presume to burst into a lady's dressing room.
What? Have my charms inflamed you?
Do not jest. I come here at the company's behest.
Your constant rhyming, sir, is quite outrageous.
'Tis force of habit.
And, I fear, contagious.
We worship Shakespeare. We repudiate these changes you have introduced of late. You dare replace the words on which we dote.
With ones the writer actually wrote.
You tarnish his resplendent memory by digging up a crude vulgarity which in our cultured age would scandalize.
Your primness grants no right to vandalize.
It is you who are the vandal. How barbaric deleting the improvements made by Garrick.
I like a text that doesn't mollycoddle the audience with sentimental twaddle.
Hello, my name is Sarah Edmonds. I am the editor-in-chief of For Page and Screen magazine. I'm here today with Rex McGregor, who is an author and playwright. He is the author of Restoring Romeo, which we had the honor of publishing in our most recent issue, issue 3. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand.
Yes, I think you are our most distant interviewee from where our editors are based. We had one author out of Singapore, so she's almost quite as far away, but not quite. Great. So if you don't mind, just to start, tell me a little bit about what Restoring Romeo is all about, first of all, and what inspired you to write it.
Okay, so a lot of my short plays, which I specialise in, are based on prompts from theatres, and this is no exception. So a theatre in New York set out some requirements for a competition, and it was for a short play with heightened language on the theme restoration. So I got my head scratching and thought, what could I use to meet that theme of restoring something? And I thought about Shakespearean texts in the 19th century where they didn't use the original Hamlet or the original Romeo and Juliet or the original King Lear. They would use a bowdlerized text that was curated to suit the delicate sensitivities of their audiences. So I did some little bit of research, mainly through Wikipedia, which is often a good start, to find out, were there any interesting stories related to, the way they started using the original Shakespearean texts. And I came across this wonderful American actor who was from your part of the world, from Pennsylvania. And her name was Charlotte Cushman. And she was a world famous actor in her day. And as with a lot of famous actors, the majority of the repertory was what they called Shakespeare. but it was actually these bowdlerized versions of Shakespeare. And when she went to London, as a lot of the actors in America did, to go to the source of the globe and meet with the true Shakespearean spirit, she wanted to get back to the original texts. So she was also notorious for playing male parts, or trouser roles as they called them in those days. So that would be characters like Rosalind from As You Like It, and Viola in Twelfth Night, and Portia in The Merchant. So that was fairly typical in those days for women to do those roles, but she wanted to expand out of that and play Romeo rather than playing Juliet, for example. So she was one of the first female actors that played male roles on the stage, and she wanted to use Shakespeare's original text. And the theatre manager and a lot of other members of her company disagreed, and that's what this play focuses on.
That's fascinating. I honestly did not know any of that history. That's really, really interesting. Honored to be from Pennsylvania. I also, you mentioned this was kind of based off of a prompt. I quite recently, this morning, actually, this morning here, was speaking with another one of our authors, Barbara Blattner. I'm not sure if you had.
Yes, I do know her.
Yeah. The other piece of hers that we published, Spell, was based off of a prompt about adapting a Shakespeare or classic play, I believe was the prompt. And that was how she got her script Spell, which is an adaptation on The Tempest. So thank you, New York theaters, for giving us these great plays. I think that's fantastic. But yeah, that's really, really fascinating. I'm curious because if I remember right, there's a lot of very, I'm trying to figure out how to word this. The character, your main character in Restoring Romeo, she has a romance with another woman. Correct me if I'm wrong. I remember that. Were you kind of inspired by this real life actor, her draw to trouser roles? Did that kind of inspire that? I'm curious how that aspect of the character came about.
Yes, so the first couple of pages of this play focuses on her conversation between Charlotte and her maid Sally. And to get some of the exposition over, Charlotte is writing a letter to her, what she calls wife, over in America. She's Charlotte is in London touring the play Romeo, and the lesbian relationship was obviously very unorthodox in those days, and although they considered themselves wife and wife, there was of course no official ceremony, but that was what they referred to themselves as. And later on in life, Charlotte became quite the central focus for a group of radical expatriate women living in Europe, where they could live more freely than they could in Philadelphia or Boston, as she refers to the places which wouldn't accept her back home. And yes, that was an interesting aspect. And the reason I started off with that too is because there is a link between her saying she wants to lead an authentic life where she can be true to her nature. So there's a link there between what she wants to do in her private life and what she's doing with her professional life, is getting back to the authentic Shakespeare. So I like the idea of there being different levels in the play.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that connection. I really do. This character, honestly, it's so inspiring, really, in that way, wanting to be authentic in her personal life. And just, I love the way she talks around the men in this play, the way she kind of leads them in circles. It's great. It's entertaining to read, and it really shows her prowess as an intellectual woman who will get what she wants, however possible. Um, so it's just inspiring. It's an entertaining play, but it's inspiring. Um, Now, if you don't mind, walk me through a little bit of the process, not necessarily for this play, but in general, when you start to write at a play. How do you go from idea to finished product?
Okay, so let's just take this one as an example. So I was given that trigger, so just the word restoration and the form heightened language. So I sort of knew straight away that I was going to write a similar play to what I'd done previously with some Shakespearean texts. So I've previously written an alternative ending to Romeo and Juliet, where they both survive, but it's a comic version, and it's all based on the fact that Juliet is 13 in the play, and I've always been a bit uncomfortable with her having that relationship when she's 13. So in this version, she is tricked by another character into believing that she's married to Romeo, but she hasn't actually been married to him. And in the end, she realizes that her fantasies about the Romeo that she thought she married weren't true. He was involved with another character. So it's just a way of twisting it. And I also wrote another play based on Richard III, which was called Henry VII, If Shakespeare Was Honest. In both of those plays, I'd used the form of not only iambic pentameter, but rhyming couplets all the way through. So I enjoy writing songs and parody lyrics. So I'm quite talented, as some people say, at using verse. So I wanted to get that into this play. So I decided to start off though with the characters just speaking prose when Sally is talking to Charlotte in the first few pages. But then I introduced the villain of the piece, who was also based on an actual actor from American theatre history, Edwin Forrest. So he bursts in speaking Shakespearean language, and the other characters like catch this contagion. They're used to speaking it on the stage. So in this play, they all speak for the rest of the duration of the action in Shakespearean rhyming verse. So there's a lot of comedy to be milked from that. And once I'd made that decision on, starting with prose and moving into the verse, it sort of prompted me with the ideas of who the characters would be. So immediately Edwin was going to be the villain. So I made him a jealous person who wanted the role that Charlotte was stealing from him. So that's what sends the action of the plot. So I always think it's important for a play not just to take the situation where, Charlotte wants to restore the original text. That's the idea and the situation of the play. But for me, in order for it to be dramatically interesting, there has to be some pushback. Who wants to stop her from getting what she wants? And in this case, it's Edwin, and he's got his own motivation he's got several motivations. He originally says, he loves the Garrick version that they're using, and he uses all these excuses, but eventually it comes out that he just, he's reduced to playing Tybalt, and he doesn't want that. He wants to play Romeo himself. So he figures that if he can annoy her enough, she will leave the theatre and let him play the role. So that's his motivation. But when Charlotte catches on with this, she fights back and decides, what can I do about it? How can I actually get my way by pretending to want the original fake text? So she fights back, and there's a lot of to and fro. So that's the approach where you have to think, once you've got the initial idea of the situation, then you have to dramatize it so that there's back and forward. And I think there's always reversals where at the top of one page, somebody might have the upper hand, but something switches. And by the end of the next page, they're no longer in that same position. So at some points in this play, Edwin thinks that he is going to win, but because of the arc of the play, he's never going to win. He's the baddie, and because of the shape of this play, it's how does Charlotte get her way? So that's what the engine behind the drama is. And I always do think it's important that you have this tension between the protagonist and the antagonist.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned about Edwin having multiple motives. He has several. He is the big one, but he has several. And having those layers to the antagonist and to the other characters is so, so important for the depth of the story. And it's something that can be really difficult in a short form. I mean, this script is under 15 pages. It's fewer than 15 pages, I believe. That is hard to capture in that short of a format. And you had mentioned earlier that you work a lot in short form scripts. What drew you to that? How did you really dive into that format?
Yeah, so I did start off in my early days of playwriting, writing longer scripts, but had less success for various reasons, partly because I was often dealing with historical themes, which were described in one review as I loved reading this play, but it is a little bit out of touch with contemporary theatrical taste. So I began to look at other ways of exploring theatre, and there was a series of events called Short and Sweet, which was like a festival of short plays where they would do about 10-minute plays with one evening's entertainment. And that festival came to Auckland here, and I watched it and I thought, oh, gee, I could do that. That looks like fun. And in that audience, a woman I knew mentioned that she belonged to a theatre collective where they were doing some readings of short plays, and they got some funding from the local council to pay actors, which is always a good thing. And she asked me to submit something. So I wrote a couple of short plays, and both of them were accepted for readings. And that's where it all took off. So I really got some experience there hearing my works read by actors, and I started submitting to some opportunities overseas because there was relatively little opportunity here. And as a few years went on, I got more and more productions overseas, and I came to specialize in this form of 10-minute comedies that usually have around 2 to 4 characters where they have a complete story arc within the 10 minutes. And I've continued doing that. And it's actually increased since the world shut down because of COVID. What happened then was I'd already established a lot of contacts with theatre groups overseas, but in the early days of COVID, a lot of theatre groups went on to Zoom and were doing lots of readings. And I've joined a number of those and was having regular readings every week, several in New York, some in London, some in Los Angeles, and in various other places. I do a regular one in Paris, for example, where a woman runs an English language online theatre group for English speakers in Paris and in the UK. So the short form theatre is quite an international thing. So we get writers from all over, and a lot of us know each other and appear on these various groups. And I've been continuing with that because although theatre went back live, a number of groups have continued on Zoom. So one of the theatre groups is called Pages in New York. It's run by Don Loftus, who is an amazing playwright. And it usually has 40 to 50 people each week on the Zoom group, where actors are really keen to read the writer's work. So early on, I was doing every week there. Now it's about once every 3 weeks because they've included so many writers. But I'm regularly having new works read. And the beauty is, I know now that whenever I write something new and I want to see is it working or not, within a week or two, I can get really competent actors, and I know most of them, so I can do the casting myself and choose the right personality types. So I get pretty much immediate feedback now on my writing, and that's just so wonderful, because in my early days, the challenge was you would write these plays, send them off, but you could be waiting months or years before you got someone to actually speak those lines for you to hear. Now I'm getting immediate feedback, and I know whether something should be expanded or not, or whether just honed. One of the other reasons that my works aren't so suited for longer plays is that they're really quite concentrated. So I do a lot of editing. So when you say that Restoring Romeo is only a little over 10 pages, that's because I snip, cut, and everything that isn't really essential to the plot, even though, something might be like a good gag, if it isn't related to revealing character or pushing the plot forward, I just often have to let it go, because I often have far more words than I can fit into my limited window. So this means that things happen quite fast. And when this is just my style of writing, when this happens within a full-length play, it can be quite overwhelming. So you can imagine bang, 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 plot changes all the time. It can almost feel a little bit farcical, even when you're doing a serious play. So that's another reason why this style of writing is more suited to comedy.
That's fantastic. I've heard from a few people now about all of the different opportunities that came around after the pandemic happened. And I think that's so important, because writing in general is a very solitary act. We sit, we look at a page alone, we research alone. That opportunity to hear the lines spoken out loud, to see the actors' expressions as they say them, even if just through video, it sounds like it would be so valuable. What's that like? What does it feel like the very first time you hear the words spoken out loud?
It's sometimes a revelation, but sometimes just like a confirmation. So a lot of writers have the voices going on in their heads. So when we think of different characters, we're thinking of different dialects, often different ages of voices. And when you can hear that aloud, it often just confirms that, yeah, that was what I was going for. Or you might think, oh, maybe I just went a bit overboard on that, and just pull it back a bit. So that can be quite good. The other beauty of having so many Zoom readings is that you get the opportunity to have multiple readings, often on different sides of the Atlantic. So when you get a company of British actors performing one of your plays, you often get a different result from a group of actors in New York. So I really try to make a lot of my plays transatlantic now. So I've written some plays for New Zealand, and a lot of them are quite specific to in terms of the language and in terms of the cultural. So a lot of the references won't get picked up. For example, in New Zealand English, we use a lot of the native Māori words in our normal conversation. But I generally will edit those out when I do a version for the UK or the US. So when you're writing transatlantically, you have to be aware of other things like different words for different things. Like once I was caught out by having a lift instead of an elevator in an American play. And there's a wonderful anecdote where Hollywood made a movie about London, which they called The Sidewalks of London. But every British person laughs at that because they don't have sidewalks, they have footpaths. So I just have to be aware of the differences between American and British when I'm writing for the different audiences. So I do try to write for a general type of audience. So some plays often will be more specific. This Restoring Romeo will mean more to somebody who is familiar with Shakespeare because there's references to Othello and Hamlet within it. But I also try to make it so that if you don't know Shakespeare, you can still enjoy the play on some level. So I'm trying to be a sort of like a universal writer as much as I can.
Definitely. And I think this play, as an example, would work for someone who even isn't as familiar with Shakespeare, for sure. I've definitely been there with the changing lingo. I once had a conversation with someone who was from England, and we were talking about torches, and we were talking about two completely different things. And I'm like, oh, figured it out. But yeah, exactly. Figured it out eventually. But I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, I guess it makes sense. It's the shape is similar, but absolutely when you're writing for audiences around the world, it's hard. Like, what concessions do you make when? Who do you write for? What words do you choose? I feel like that would be especially difficult in something like this, where you did kind of slip into that, not slip in, it was intentional, not slip in, but you did go into that verse for the dialogue, and there are patterns that you made yourself adhere to. And if you're picking words for one group or another, trying to fit into the rhyme scheme, trying to fit into the it's escaping me, the rhythm, that is not the word I mean, but the rhythm of it might be hard, I imagine.
And one of the challenges for me here, so I'm in New Zealand, so generally we speak a form of British English as a rule. So generally we would say a lift rather than an elevator, but everybody will know what you're talking about. Because we see so much American TV and American movies, none of the words that are that you use are unfamiliar to us. We know them all, but it gets a bit awkward sometimes when I don't know whether a phrase or a word that I'm familiar with is British or American. Like it came up recently in one of my plays, I'd used the phrase bully for you, which is a British phrase, which means like good on you, whereas some of the Americans didn't recognize what it meant.
Okay.
You see, so I have to think, to me, it's just like a standard English phrase because I've heard it all my life, but I've probably heard it from British TV series or rather than from American ones. So I sometimes don't know without referring to somebody or looking it up whether something is American or British. So it's really interesting, and I'm discovering there are a lot more subtleties in the differences of the language than I had originally thought. I thought originally it was just like vocabulary, but it's phrases like what was a good example I had recently? Oh, I was writing a play about gambling, and it's set in Las Vegas. And one thing writers try to do is try to vary the vocabulary just to make it interesting and have different characters use different terms. So the British and us, we have this term for gambling called have a flutter. which means that you know, just play on the pokies for a little while, you have a flutter, which is a lovely evocative phrase, but I understand that no Americans would recognize it. So I had to leave it out of that play. And I couldn't think of an equivalent. I think I might have used something like gaming or something really bland. So I actually find that the British have more of those little colourful turns of phrase for common activities. So in some ways, it's a bit of a challenge, and that's one of the advantages of writing for a group who know me as a writer and won't hesitate to say, Rex, we don't say that. So I'll just cross it out and substitute it. So I do have this luxury now that I didn't have originally of getting, you know, some responses from the actual speakers.
That's fantastic. This is a personal anecdote. When I was growing up, like early elementary school, one of my favorite book series was apparently written in British English. And I was a child. I had no idea. So I was spelling a lot of words with the U and with E instead of A. And just because I read these books obsessively, and that's how I saw them written. And I had to unlearn so many of those because like I had the red squiggly line in word, and then the teachers were like, "That's not right." I will stand by gray with an E, though. It is not an A. I will never write it with an A. I can't do it. I can't.
Here's a good one for you. How do you spell theatre?
Okay, I spelled it differently, whether I'm talking about a movie theater or a stage theater. It's ER for a movie theater, but RE for like a stage. And
that's an interesting. I hadn't heard of that variation.
I don't think there's any rule to that. I just think it sounds fancier that way in my head.
Well, I think from what I heard or what I've read, that the fanciness actually does come into it. So if you look at the actual names of some of the theatres, like on Broadway, they will often have the RE spelling, like the Palace Theatre.
Yes.
Which will have an RE spelling. But when people just talk about the activity of doing theatre, they will often do the ER spelling. So there is a little bit of snobbishness from the establishment, you know, that to name a theatre, you want to be like Shakespeare. So you want to have the RE to, you know, reinforce your links with the West End and London, where that eminent tradition came from, you know. Jolly good. That is, I understand the rationale for it. So it is interesting, that particular word.
It definitely is. I'm fascinated by all of the different nuances of language, and especially British English to American English. Some things just feel really arbitrary, honestly. And then some cases like that, you can feel the, like you were saying, the prestige of it is a driving force, whether real or fabricated. But either way, it's fun. It's fun to learn about, fun to talk about. Now, do you often have historical elements to your plays that you write?
Yeah, so I'm a big history fan, so I've written a lot of plays with a historical setting. So I'm a big Shakespeare fan. So I've written a whole series of shorts plays to do with Shakespeare. So I've grouped them together into a compilation called Honest Shakespeare. But I've written several other compilations. For example, I've got a series of 3 plays called Female Scientists to the Rescue. So the first one is called Zany Planets, and it focuses on a young Copernicus who meets the ancient Egyptian astronomer Hypatia, a woman who lived 1,000 years before him, but she appears as his muse, as it were, and she rescues him and helps him discover the truth about the heavens. And the second play in that series is called Table in the Air, and that's about Marie Curie and her husband in Paris in 1905. And she is rescuing her husband, who has fallen into the clutches of a notorious fraud, this woman called Eusapia Palladino, who is an Italian conjurer who claims to have all these supernatural powers. And Marie Curie tries to debunk this and stops her husband from embarrassing himself. And the third play in that little series is set in the French Revolution. And that's about the famous French chemist Lavoisier, who was executed by the revolutionaries, and how his wife tried to rescue him and carry on with his work. And that's one of the plays that I've got a reading of in a couple of days at my New York Pages group. So that has actually been produced on stage somewhere in the US, but I've only seen photos. So this is a play that I haven't actually heard read aloud. So I'm really looking forward to that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's and in terms of history, I've written plays based on the ancient Greek theatre. So I've written a couple about Odysseus and his travels, and I've written about a famous romance writer, Eleanor Hibbert, who wrote under some names like Jean Plaidy or Victoria Holt, you might have heard of. Mm-hmm. So she had various personas. So I wrote a play called Rival Pseudonyms, where her three pseudonyms meet and interact and don't get on. So theatre gives you the opportunity to go anywhere you want. So I've really enjoyed exploring characters that I've always been fascinated with. So sometimes I put two characters together from history that I've never seen in any movie or stage production. For example, some of the plays I just write for myself and think, oh, nobody will ever produce this. And a good example was one I wrote called Queen Takes Emperor, and it was about Queen Louise of Prussia, who went on a mission to Napoleon, who had just defeated her kingdom, and he was going to carve up her kingdom and basically destroy it. And she was desperate to preserve it. And I thought, this is about a 30-minute play with just two actors on stage, a lot of banter, and I've seen a couple of readings on Zoom, and everybody really enjoyed it. But I thought, it's probably a bit of a hard ask to think of a theatre actually producing something like this. But every so often, I just send plays out on the off chance, and believe it or not, that cultural backwater, perhaps Australia was the first people to pick it up. So I had a production in Sydney because the director of the theatre really, really loved this play, and she produced it and produced a really lively version with a snappy pace. In fact, she sent me the video, and the first thing I do was look at the length of the video, and it was 20 odd minutes. And I thought, oh dear, this is a 30-minute play. I wonder what she's cut out. She hadn't cut anything out. She'd just gone bang, 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 and just made it like really, really lively and fast paced. And it really, really gave it that extra oomph, which I hadn't really considered, because I'd treated it more on the serious level. But by pushing the comedy more, she got a real rise out of the audience, and it went down very well. So I never give up on any of my plays now, even the ones that I think, that might be a bit of a hard sell. You just need to find the right director or the right theatre that's willing to take a chance on it.
I love that. That's fantastic. How do you, if you don't mind, this is mostly me just being curious, Um, how do you go about sending plays out to theaters? What does that process look like?
Oh, so these days, a lot of theatres that have short play festivals will put out a call saying in a couple of months we're doing a festival on this theme, or we're doing some plays for Christmas. Could you send us something? So it's just a matter of sending off an email. So I have all my scripts ready to be sent out. So I often do some of them ask for a blind script that is with no mention of the author on it. So I just have a filing convention where I know which are the blind scripts. And if they ask for that, I can send it off as an attachment. Or if they ask for the full script with your contact details, I'll send them that. So it's usually all done by email now. A few years ago, a lot of people were asking for things to be sent physically through the mail, and that was a real grind. And just the postage from New Zealand, is it worth it? This is a long shot. But nowadays, it's so easy to send an email. And there is another online project called the New Play Exchange. I don't know if you've heard about it.
Okay.
But what it is it's a website where writers post their scripts and theatres or readers can access those scripts and read them online and contact the author if they want to get the performance rights. I've had a few productions as a result of that, and I've got one coming up in a month or so. So this latest one, for example, it's a school production where the teacher has said, my students came across this script, they'd like to produce it at the end of the month. Can we have the rights? And I just give them, I have an agent in New Zealand who will deal with the financial side of it. So the process is often just me sending out the scripts, but it's really, I wish more people would use the New Play Exchange, because a lot of my scripts are on there. So anybody can, for a small fee, join that website and access the scripts. There's no real concern about people running off with the scripts or stealing them. That doesn't really happen in the theatre world, because a lot of it's a world where everybody's very supportive, and if anybody does that sort of thing, they get blacklisted pretty fast. So the other thing that is of concern to a lot of writers is that a lot of theatres will have submission fees, and a lot of writers are just very anti. Why should we pay to submit a script? You don't ask an actor to pay to audition for a role. Why should you pay a writer to submit? So there are various Facebook groups, like the official Playwrights of Facebook, where you get some quite heated discussions on these issues. And there's a wonderful group called the Playwrights Binge, where every 6 months or so they will target a particular aspect of promoting their scripts to theatres. So you can actually also just contact theatres cold, which means they haven't asked for scripts, but if you see they've been doing the type of work that you work with, they may be interested in reading your work. I haven't had a lot of results from that approach, so I tend to favour something where there is an actual festival coming up, and even though hundreds of people may be competing for it, you at least know that there's a chance of you getting a production. And these happen frequently all over the US, less often now in the UK. That used to be more prevalent pre-COVID, but I think theatre is struggling even more there. And even in New Zealand, there are a few small companies. Just this weekend, I had one of my short comedies, Monstrous Villainy, performed, and I didn't get a chance. This was down in the South Island. I've been down to see productions there previously, but this time I'll just wait to see the video and see what they make of it. So often when in this situation you hand the script over to the director, and experienced directors will normally just take it and put their stamp on it. It's the more inexperienced directors that will want you to hold their hand and, what did you mean by this line? And, will ask you more questions. So these days, when I'm dealing with more experienced directors, I have a very hands-off approach. And I actually enjoy watching different interpretations. A good example is one of my most popular plays is called Threatened Panda Fights Back. So it's about a very entitled panda who's the poster boy for the World Wildlife Fund. And he just wants this nice cruisy life where he's got all the bamboo, he's in a zoo, he's being looked after. He doesn't want anybody to rock the boat, but a rival species is out for his role. So he has to think fast. And this play has been produced in so many different ways. So some people just use normal day clothing, sometimes with a little bit of eye makeup to indicate that they're pandas. Some will do full body bear suits where you can't even see the actors' faces. And some will use a particular take on it. So one version in London, they decided to make the pandas like gangsters, just to have a particular take on it, and it was quite funny. So you can actually interpret plays, particularly when they've been done a few times. It's like Hamlet, you don't want to see the same version of Hamlet every year. Directors want to do something different with it. So it is interesting when a director decides, well, I'll put my particular vision on this play.
Is it ever hard to give them that freedom, or was it when you were first starting out difficult to let go?
Yeah, I can remember some of the first plays where I was a bit protective of the play, where I would make suggestions to the director. And I actually did something which is a big no-no early on in the days, which was make direct suggestions to the actors, which is, you should never do that. A playwright should only contact the director, and usually only in response to their questions. So the only times I ever direct actors was when, so I'm doing a bit of directing online now myself, or for some of these Zoom readings where the actors may ask for some advice, and there usually isn't a director for the Zoom readings. But for stage productions, I would never directly give advice to an actor. So if an actor did come, it hasn't actually happened, but if an actor did come to me and say, how should I read this line, Rex? My immediate response would be, consult your director. If they need any clarification, I'm happy to give it to them. Sometimes a director might, ask, I don't quite understand, what's this transition here, or what are you going for in this little section of the play? That's fine, but with experienced directors, they just run with it. And I've got to the stage now where I'm just happy to see what they do with it. Sometimes it may not be what you pictured at all, and you may not sort of agree with the interpretation, but who cares? I'm sure Shakespeare wouldn't like every version of Hamlet that's ever been done, but the important thing is that the work is out there being performed, and it's really good that sometimes people might put in a controversial spin on a work, which is interesting. So I feel quite comfortable with whatever directors do. I give them a completely free hand. In fact, I don't even ask, I just wait, sit back. Like this recent one, I had no contact with the director whatsoever. I'll just wait and watch the video.
I aspire to be able to have that attitude. When I write scripts, I always have a moment where I'm like, oh, but I want it to be that color, or I want it to be shot. And I would never tell someone, no, don't do that. But it's hard to kind of silence that voice in the back of your head that is doing the internal commentary, even if it's not external. But yeah, what's it like directing, shifting into this role as director yourself? What's that like?
Yeah. So I've only actually ever directed one live stage production, and I found it really challenging. You have to deal with things like booking rehearsal space, organising the times when everybody's going to be available, and it's a lot of work that's not directly related to getting the script up there. So I personally would prefer not to direct stage productions. I have huge admiration for anybody that's good at corralling people and getting them into the same place and sticking to a timetable. So hats off for them to doing that. But I am doing a fair amount of Zoom directing. To give you an example of how some of these Zoom workshops work, there's one called LA Play Reading, and they have a format where I do the casting ahead of time and the actors read the script ahead of time, so they're all familiar with it. But we don't meet on Zoom before the event. But the first hour of the event, we all go into a breakout room, which you can do on Zoom. So each writer goes with their cast and does the rehearsal. So I enjoy there. We often start with just talking about the style of the performance. I did one the other day where it was a comedy. It was called The Tarantula's Pet Frog. So it had a frog and a scorpion and a spider as the characters. So after a few raised eyebrows, the actors really got into it because it really needed this heightened performance. So I told them, just don't read the words, live the characters. This little frog is about to lose his life if he doesn't talk his way out of the situation. So I really enjoy motivating the actors, and it's often is giving them, what their motivation is and why it's important for them to get what they want. What are the stakes for this character if they don't get it? So you have to sort of like speak in those terms to the actor. One tip I was given by Tony Forster, a director friend of mine who lives here locally, is that you don't actually give them line readings. So you don't say, this is how you say the line, and he never does that. He tells them, what are you trying to evoke by saying this line? And if they don't get it wrong, if they don't get it right, he will say, try it another way where you're trying to persuade me or you're trying to seduce me. So how are you going to deliver this line? Because one of the difficulties with actors working on an unfamiliar script is that if they're a bit insecure, they will often just read everything in a very flat monotone, being very cautious, and they don't make as many bold steps where you want them to be like this, and dramatic. And particularly for theatre, you need to be theatrical often. Mm-hmm. So I do enjoy getting performances out of actors, at least on Zoom, where I don't have to worry so much about the sheer practicalities of rehearsal space, etc.
Definitely wrangling more than two people into a room at once can be challenging. I understand. So if you had to pick between writing, working with actors, working with directors, what is your one favorite part of the process?
The most enjoyable part of the process is just having written the play. So when you reach a stage, somebody asked me the other day, Rex, how do you know when you're finished? So you often are tinkering with it, and you finish the play and you often think, oh, well, I'll have to revise it. And you come back in a few days and you think, oh, there's still some cut and nips and tucks that you can do here, tighten this. And you go through this agonizing period where you think, oh, have I given too much weight to this character? Have I got the balance right? Is the resolution right? Did I camouflage my exposition at the beginning? The beginnings of plays are quite challenging because you can't just say, I'm a plastic surgeon, I'm a travel agent. So in one of my plays, the way I get around this is by using phrases like, oh, you can afford it on a surgeon's salary. So that tells you that the other character is a surgeon. Or, the glamorous life of a tour guide. That tells you that the other character is a tour guide without them having to spell it out. So that's some of the challenges. So once you've got through all of that and you're satisfied, it's quite rewarding to just sit back and think, right, I think I've done as much as I can with this play now. I'm ready to hand it over to maybe the Pages group to do the first reading. And I've got the actors that can read it. And I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm in that position with this play called Mother of Chemistry that I was talking about, Lavoisier. So I've never heard it. I wrote the play a little while ago. It's been produced and I've seen photos, but I still don't know whether it works on stage. So I'm really at this stage now where I'm just really, I've got some brilliant actors, particularly the main characters, Lavoisier and his wife. They're played by actors that I've worked with many times. And when I approached the actor playing the main role, he said, you know me so well, because it's the sort of role that he just loves. In fact, that actor played Edwin in the recording.
Okay, awesome.
He chews the scenery in this one, but he'll be lovely and serious in this version that's coming up, but give it that comic edge where it's necessary. So even though this play ends with the guy being carted off to the guillotine, there is a nice twist at the end where there's some sort of satisfying resolution where his wife is actually going to carry on his work for him. So there are little comic touches throughout it, and there's, it's not too heavy, and I believe that the actors will pull it off. So I think that's the most satisfying. Even more so to just hand it over to those actors and just see what they come up with without me giving them any direction. In fact, the only direction I did give them was in the, I asked them, don't use French accents, because it would be like playing Hamlet with a Danish accent or Romeo with an Italian accent. You wouldn't do that. But I did ask them to get the correct pronunciation for personal names. So, that will, it's always good to be respectable for somebody's personal name. So Lavoisier rather than Lavoisier, which if you didn't, I actually sent them YouTube links to somebody, a French person, pronouncing the names, so they get them right. So I'm sure they'll do that wonderfully. So it's little things like that are important for the play, that it would really annoy me if they called Saint Just Saint Just, because that's not his name. It's like saying Beethoven instead of Beethoven, It would annoy me a little bit that if they did that.
Absolutely. I'm sure they appreciate both the links and the references, but also the freedom to do what they know how to do best as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Actors love to act. So you just, particularly for a reading where there's not a lot writing on it, and if they go too far or they don't do the right interpretation, it's no harm done. So, that's why I'm not at all, apart from like the pronunciation, I'm not really protective about the play to the extent that, oh, you've killed my baby. It's not like that, because this is only a step on the journey of the play. And hopefully, my dream is to have multiple productions of far more of my plays all over the world. And that Juliet play, for example, has been produced probably about a dozen times all over the place, because it does appeal to people, but the directors take different takes on it. It's been done in modern dress, it's been done in full medieval costumes with giant swords. So there's a lot of flexibility in theatre to explore different ways of presenting work.
I love that. And I love that way of looking at it, because even though these are done on the page, like they're never really done. They can exist in so many ways in perpetuity. And that's kind of the dream of it. I love that. I love that way of looking at it. Perfect. Then can you tell me a little bit about what you're working on now, what's coming out next? Where can we see your work soon?
Okay, so there are several opportunities to see my work. So anybody in New York, for example, will have a couple of opportunities over the next month or so. So later this week, I have a production of a short comedy called Marietta's Ultimatum, being produced at the Salmagundi Arts Club, which is a prestigious building in Lower Manhattan. And that's part of a group show called Spring Thaw. And that the way that came about is it's produced by a company called Winterlight Productions. And one of the producers there is a regular attendant at one of the Zoom readings that I do weekly, which is Anything Goes, run by the Artistic New Directions Theatre in New York. So she has performed a lot of my work, and she actually performed in the reading on one of these, in the reading of Marietta's Ultimatum at Anything Goes. But she's decided to assign it to a more, a character, to an actor who is more like the character, who is the painter Broncia Colapinel, who was a Jewish painter working in Austria at the beginning of the century. And this play is based on a painting that she did. So, and what is good is, though, that the actor who played Marietta in the reading will actually get the chance to play Marietta on stage. So that I'm really looking forward to see either photos or a video of that production. So that will be fun. And coming up, I recently, well, not so recently, a little while ago now, did a Zoom recording of a play called Sunshine in Every Window. This is a play that was produced in New York several years ago, and it's about the first public housing that was established in New York, which might sound like a dry topic, but there was a lot of behind the scenes machinations, and there was one particular unsung heroine, a city planner called Mary Sinkovich, who was pulling strings behind everybody's back, and there's a lot of fun, and it's like a comic take on it. And for this production, which was done on Zoom, I had actors from 6 different cities in the US. So they're all American actors, but I've got someone from San Diego, someone from New York, someone from Philadelphia, and they've all come together, and it's one of those plays that has multiple scene changes. It's about 30 minutes, and we did it in sections. So we've got costumes where the main character has about 4 or 5 costume changes, and it's set in 1939. So we've got the period flavour, and that Zoom recording will be produced at the Rogue Festival online. So if you go onto my website, you can find the link for that when closer to the time where audiences can tune in and watch that play. And later on in June, I've got a production of another short comedy, which, here's another coincidence. That play I just mentioned about the housing, features Eleanor Roosevelt in a minor role, and she will be in this next play in a featuring role. So the next play is called Amazons of Tomorrow, and it features Eleanor Roosevelt presiding over the New York World's Fair and trying to remove all the lewd elements. For example, they had sunbathers, sun worshippers, and burlesque dancers representing Paris. And she disapproves of all this because she wants it to focus on the science, and it's an expo of showing all the advances in American society. But the other side of it is that she was in an intimate relationship with another woman, which is not widely known, and she was struggling to keep this a secret. And that's what the play focuses on, and that will be on stage in Manhattan in June. So those are some of the upcoming productions. And the interesting thing is that both those plays were originally produced in New York. I think it was in 2017, more or less at the same time. So one of the things I don't get an opportunity to do is see a lot of my productions live when they are in the US. So I arrived in New York just after that performance of Amazons of Tomorrow, but I did go to the theatre where they produced it. So it was in the park in Queens where the New York's fair, World Fair, was held, and that's basically like most of the buildings from the fair have been dismantled, but there's still a giant globe and a giant peristyle, so you can still see where the remains of the fair that is talked about in the play. So it was interesting to see that, and they took me into the theatre and showed me the ghost light, because it was in the middle of the day, that was shining while they were waiting for the next production. So it was lovely to see the environment where that was played. And what I wanted to just tell you was that there's only been one occasion where I've actually seen one of my productions in the US, and that's because I'd already planned to have a around the world trip. Before COVID, I was going around the world every couple of years, so I'm very well travelled. So I know a lot of cities in Europe and in the US. And I originally had my plan to go, I think, from San Francisco to Chicago, then to New York, and then off to Europe. So, I usually do about 6 weeks or a 2-month holiday, because if you're going to go from New Zealand, you may as well spend a lot of time there. So after I'd booked my tour, I discovered that a small theatre in Las Vegas was going to do a production on my Harry Potter comedy called Tickle That Dragon, and I thought, I'd love to see that. So it would have been when I was in San Francisco. So what I did is I just changed the departure flight so that I went a few days earlier, went to San Francisco, and inserted Las Vegas into my itinerary. So I went there for a couple of days and turned up to the theatre, and they made me feel very welcome. And I got a photo with the cast, which is always great. So that was the first and only time I've had a chance to see one of my productions in the US. So that was a lovely opportunity. And I should really be doing more, starting up my world travels again, but I'm just so busy these days. I don't have the energy to organise one of those giant world trips. And I'm also a bit concerned about the state of the world, because I don't know what if you realise that what happened during the pandemic, a lot of people that were overseas were prevented from coming back home because we were trying it for many months to stop COVID from entering our country until the vaccinations had been developed. So as a result of that policy, a lot of people were prevented from coming back. And although they, kicked up a fuss about it, what actually happened is our country had a far lower death rate, proportionally than your country, for example, because we took extreme measures fairly early on.
Mhm.
And we're relaxed now, and there are people dying, but at least it's not the thousands of deaths that we would have had, even for a country our small size, if we hadn't taken those radical measures. So I'm a bit cautious about things like the state of Europe at the moment. Is the war going to spill over? So I'm being a bit cautious about traveling overseas, but I will eventually get over and hopefully see some productions.
That's completely understandable. Yeah, I believe the US had in some circles, had somewhat of an opposite policy when everything shut down. A friend of mine was overseas in either London or Rome. I can't remember which city. For studying abroad, and they made her come home, and they made everyone who was abroad come back. And I understood the rationale, but it also felt counterintuitive for the exact reasons that you were saying. But yeah, so hopefully in the future, once your schedule clears up and once things are more predictable, you'll be able to go see them in person, because I feel like that would be an unbeatable experience, whether not just in the US, but anywhere, to see them produced live. I think that would be amazing. So my final question for you is a bit of a sidestep from our recent conversation, but I've been asking everyone if you could give one piece of advice to other writers out there, playwrights, directors, creatives in general, what might that be?
There's a wonderful quote from Stephen Sondheim, which I often think about, and it's less is more. And what he means by that is you can actually convey far more if you trim things back to their essentials. And I notice myself now, whenever I'm watching something, I'm very conscious of, do they really need that? When I was watching a movie the other day, a very popular movie that's extremely well received, but there are a lot of scenes in there that you probably don't really need, And I think you've got to be quite rigorous in the editing phase. I think it's fine when you're writing to, you're in this inspirational mode where you just want to get everything down. And once you've actually moved away from that, and you have to put a different hat on, like the editor's hat, and you have to look at your work more critically. And, there's that other phrase, kill your darlings. You might think, oh, I love this joke. It's really, really good. But is it really needed or relevant, or does it cause a jarring note in this particular play? If you really love it, could you use it somewhere else where it's more, it fits more? And I think editing is the one thing that isn't taught. I mean, a lot of playwriting courses will go, how do you structure the story? How do you get the arc for the characters? How do you, get naturalistic dialogue? How do you camouflage your exposition? But there's far less emphasis on going back and just stepping back and having a critical view of the piece and thinking of it from the audience's point of view. Is it clear? I think theatre needs to be clear, because you can't rewind. If you're watching a video, you can think, oh, what did they say? I'll rewind that and, replay it. With theatre, if you lose that moment, the audience can't go back. And often if you lose them, you've lost them. You can't get them back. So I try to make things as accessible as possible without dumbing down, of course. So I do believe that, trimming, editing, and a good motto is when in doubt, cut.
Hard words to hear, but absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that advice and for being here and talking with me today. It's been really, really wonderful getting to meet you, getting to speak with you. So just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.